That night, the house was so quiet that even the newborn's soft breathing sounded loud. A single bedside lamp filled the bedroom with a warm yellow glow. Sarah Wilson sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around her 15-day-old baby boy. The child had finally fallen asleep, his tiny fingers curled against her chest. Sarah gently brushed her thumb across his cheek and smiled. It was the kind of smile mothers wear when they are exhausted, scared, and holding themselves together all at once. On the other side of the room, her husband Daniel Wilson sat in a chair, scrolling through his phone. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, his eyes cold. Ever since the baby was born, Daniel had changed. Before, he used to laugh easily. Before, he used to ask if Sarah needed anything. Now every sound annoyed him. Every cry made his mood worse, and Sarah noticed everything, but said nothing, because when a woman becomes a mother, she often forgets how to speak for herself. If you're someone who believes that stories about strength, patience, and unexpected justice matter, if you believe that some women are tested before they rise, then before this story continues, I want to ask you something from the heart. Please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying, "I'm listening," not just for this story, but for every woman who has ever been silenced when she needed support the most. Now, let the story begin. Sarah and Daniel had been married for 2 years. Not 20, not 10. Just 2 years. When they first met, Daniel had seemed perfect. He worked a corporate job, spoke confidently, and always talked about building a simple, happy family. Sarah believed him. She wasn't chasing luxury. She wasn't dreaming of power. She just wanted peace. The first year of marriage passed quietly. They rented a modest apartment. They cooked dinner together. They talked about the future. But when Sarah became pregnant, something inside Daniel shifted. He started coming home later. He talked more about money. He complained about pressure. "This is a lot of responsibility," he would say. Sarah tried to understand. She went through pregnancy mostly alone, telling herself that stress changes people. But after the baby was born, things got worse. Sleep disappeared. Patience vanished, and Daniel's kindness slowly died. The baby cried at night. Daniel snapped. "Can't you make him stop? I have work in the morning. You're always tired, every night." Sarah picked up the baby and walked quietly out of the room so Daniel could sleep. Every night she cried silently in the bathroom. That evening, Daniel threw his phone onto the bed in frustration. "Enough," he said sharply. Sarah looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" Daniel stood up suddenly. "I can't live like this." Sarah's heart started racing. "What do you mean?" Daniel walked to the closet, pulled out her clothes, and dropped them onto the bed. "You need to leave." The room went cold. Sarah tightened her grip on her baby. "Daniel, we just had a child." Daniel didn't even look at the baby. "I didn't sign up for this," he said. "You're always tired. The baby cries. The house is chaos." Sarah's voice shook. "Where am I supposed to go?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "That's not my problem." That night, Sarah packed a small bag. She wrapped her newborn in a blanket, and before the sun came up, she walked out of the home she had entered as a bride just 2 years earlier. What Sarah didn't know, what Daniel couldn't imagine, was that on the very day he threw her out with a newborn in her arms, she had already become the heir to a billion-dollar fortune. She just hadn't found out yet. Sarah didn't remember how long she walked. The streets were empty, the sky still dark, the city half asleep while her world had already collapsed. Her arms ached from holding the baby, but she didn't slow down. She was afraid that if she stopped, she might fall apart completely. A taxi finally pulled over. The driver glanced at her through the mirror, her pale face, the newborn pressed against her chest, the single bag at her feet. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and drove. When the car stopped in front of her parents' house, the sky had begun to lighten. A thin line of dawn stretched across the horizon. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring at the familiar front door. This was the house she had left 2 years ago as a hopeful bride. She never imagined she would return like this. She knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. Her mother, Margaret, froze when she saw her. "Sarah?" Her voice broke. "What happened?" Sarah didn't answer. She simply stepped inside and collapsed into her mother's arms. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. Margaret held her tightly, as if afraid her daughter might disappear again. Her father, Edward Carter, appeared from the hallway. He was still in his house clothes, glasses slightly crooked, his expression calm, but his eyes sharpened the moment he took in the scene. He said nothing at first. He just walked closer and placed his hand gently on the baby's blanket. "He's beautiful," Edward said quietly. Sarah finally found her voice. "He threw us out." Margaret gasped. "What?" With no warning, Sarah whispered. "He said he couldn't handle it anymore." Edward didn't react the way she expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse Daniel's name. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once. "Go lie down," he said gently. "Both of you." That calm unsettled Sarah more than anger would have. She slept for hours, the deepest sleep she had had since giving birth. When she woke, the house smelled like soup and fresh bread. The baby slept peacefully beside her. Downstairs, she heard quiet voices. Her parents were talking, but not about her. They were talking in low, serious tones. Sarah walked toward the stairs just as Edward said her name. "Sarah," he called, "come sit with us." She joined them at the kitchen table. Edward placed a thick envelope in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I should have given you a long time ago," he replied. Margaret reached for Sarah's hand. "Your grandfather passed away last month," she said softly. Sarah frowned. "Why didn't you tell me? You were pregnant," Margaret replied, "and then you gave birth. We didn't want to burden you." Edward slid the envelope closer. "Your grandfather left you everything." Sarah laughed weakly, shaking her head. "Dad, please. I don't need jokes right now." Edward didn't smile. "I'm not joking." He opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. Deeds, bank statements, legal letters. Sarah's eyes skimmed the pages without understanding, until one number caught her attention. She stopped breathing. This can't be right," she whispered. Edward looked directly at her. "Your grandfather built his wealth quietly," he said. "Private investments, offshore holdings, companies registered under trusts." Sarah's hands trembled. "How much?" she asked. Edward paused. "Just over $1 billion. The room felt suddenly too small. Sarah stared at the papers, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. "I don't understand," she said. "Why me?" Edward's voice softened. "Because he knew," he said. "He knew one day you might need protection." Sarah's throat tightened. "All this time," she whispered, "I was struggling. I was being humiliated. And he was watching," Edward finished quietly. Sarah looked up. "You knew?" she asked her father. Edward nodded. "I helped manage parts of it," he admitted. "But the inheritance became legally yours the moment your grandfather passed. I was waiting for the right time to tell you." Sarah laughed again, this time without humor. "And Daniel," she said slowly. "He kicked me out yesterday." Edward's eyes darkened for the first time. Then he chose the worst possible day. Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not joy, not revenge, clarity. All those moments she had stayed silent. All the times she had been made to feel small. They weren't proof of weakness. They were proof of endurance. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Daniel. "You need to come get the rest of your things tomorrow." Sarah looked at the screen, then at her father. Edward leaned back in his chair. "Only if you want to," he said. "This time the choice is yours." Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks her chest didn't feel tight. "No," she said calmly. "I think I'll let him wait." Outside, the morning sun rose fully over the house, and somewhere across the city, Daniel Wilson was waking up, still believing he had won. He had no idea that the woman he threw out with a newborn in her arms had just stepped into a world of power he could never touch. Daniel woke up in a good mood. Too good, actually. The house felt quieter without the baby's cries, without Sarah moving softly around the kitchen, without the constant tension he claimed had ruined his life. He stretched, checked his phone, and smirked when he saw no missed calls from her. Good, he thought. She finally understood. At the office, Daniel made sure everyone knew. During a coffee break, he leaned casually against the counter and said, loud enough for others to hear, Yeah, divorce is messy, but sometimes you have to cut dead weight. A few co-workers laughed awkwardly. One of them asked, "What about the baby?" Daniel shrugged. "She'll manage. She always does." What Daniel didn't see was the look exchanged between two senior managers standing nearby. One of them quietly said, "Isn't her last name Carter?" The other frowned. "Yeah, why?" But Daniel had already walked away, satisfied with himself. Back at her parents' house, Sarah sat by the window, gently rocking her son. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers, grounding her in the moment. For the first time since the night she was thrown out, she felt steady. Edward entered the room, phone in hand. "The lawyers are ready," he said calmly. "Whenever you are." Sarah hesitated. "I don't want to destroy him," she said softly. Edward nodded. "I know, but you also don't need to protect someone who never protected you." Sarah looked down at her son. "I just want what's fair," she said. Edward's eyes softened. "Fair," he repeated. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." 2 days later, Daniel received an email from a law firm he had never heard of, Carter and Whitmore Legal Associates. He almost deleted it, until he saw the subject line, regarding Sarah Carter and child custody proceedings. His jaw tightened. "Custody?" he scoffed. "She doesn't even have money for a lawyer." He opened the email. By the third sentence, his smirk disappeared. By the end of it, his hands were shaking. The letter was polite, professional, precise, and devastating. Sarah was filing for full custody. Sarah was requesting spousal support. Sarah was contesting the eviction. Sarah was represented by a firm known for handling high net worth cases. Daniel laughed nervously. "This is a bluff," he muttered. He immediately called his own lawyer, Mark Reynolds. "Rel." "Axe," Mark said over the phone. "She's emotional. New mom. Probably borrowed money." But even Mark sounded less confident than usual. Still, Mark added, "I'll look into the firm." An hour later, Mark called back. Daniel could hear it in his voice before he even spoke. "Daniel, where did Sarah's family say they were from?" Daniel frowned. "Just some old money people. Nothing serious." There was a pause. "Daniel," Mark said carefully. "Carter and Whitmore doesn't take bluff cases." Daniel swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mark said slowly, "someone is funding this. And not small money." That evening, Sarah sat at the dining table with Edward and Margaret. Legal documents were neatly stacked in front of her. "I feel strange," Sarah admitted, "like I'm someone else." Margaret smiled gently. "You're still you," she said. "You just stopped apologizing for existing." Edward slid one final paper toward her. "This is the trust confirmation," he said. "It's official now. No more shadows." Sarah signed. The moment the pen left the page, she felt it. Not power, but relief. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. "Sarah," Daniel's voice came through, strained. "We need to talk." She closed her eyes briefly. "About what?" she asked calmly. This lawyer thing," he said. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah looked at her son sleeping peacefully beside her. "Daniel," she said evenly, "you threw us out. You told me you were done. I'm just responding." There was silence. "You didn't even ask how we were," she added quietly. Daniel's voice dropped. "Where are you staying?" "That's not your concern anymore," Sarah replied. He exhaled sharply. "You think you can just take my child?" "Our child," Sarah corrected. Another pause. "This isn't you," Daniel said. "You're being influenced." Sarah almost smiled. "No," she said. "This is me." Without fear, she ended the call. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the past 2 years. The way Sarah never argued back, the way she always said it's fine, the way her parents never interfered. He had thought it meant weakness. Now it felt like something else. At 3:17 a.m., he sat up suddenly. "What if," he whispered to the dark room, "I made a mistake, but mistakes could be fixed." Or so he believed. The next morning, Edward received a call from a mutual acquaintance. "Daniel's been asking questions," the man said. "About you, about the family." Edward smiled faintly. "Good," he said. "It's time he starts learning." Sarah stood nearby, listening. "Court is in 3 weeks," Edward added. "By then, the truth will be unavoidable." Sarah nodded. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry. She was ready, because the man who laughed when he threw her out still believed he was in control. And the courtroom hadn't even seen the first real move yet. The courtroom was packed, not because the case was famous, but because people sensed something was about to happen. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table in his best suit, shoulders back, chin high. He looked calm on the outside, but his fingers tapped nervously against the polished wood. His lawyer, Mark Reynolds, leaned in and whispered updates every few seconds. Across the room, Sarah entered quietly. No dramatic entrance, no head held high for attention. She walked in with her father, Edward Carter, carrying her newborn in his arms. Her mother followed behind. The murmurs started instantly. "She brought the baby. Is that her father? Who are they?" Daniel glanced up and froze. He hadn't seen Sarah since the phone call. She looked different, not dressed expensively, not trying to impress, just steady, confident in a way he had never seen before. The baby stirred softly. Sarah took him back from her father and sat down without looking at Daniel even once. That hurt more than anger would have. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The case began. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, confident as always. "Your Honor, my client seeks confirmation of the divorce terms previously agreed upon. Mrs. Carter left the marital home voluntarily and—" "She was expelled," Sarah's lawyer interrupted calmly. With a newborn at midnight, the judge raised an eyebrow. Mark cleared his throat. "That is disputed." Sarah said nothing. She didn't need to. The judge turned toward her. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "is that correct?" Sarah stood slowly, holding her son. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I was told to leave. Immediately." Daniel shifted in his seat. The judge nodded. "Continue." What followed was something Daniel hadn't prepared for. Sarah's legal team didn't attack. They didn't dramatize. They presented facts, text messages, security footage timestamps, witness statements from neighbors. Then something else. A document appeared on the screen. Daniel leaned forward. "What's that?" he whispered. Mark's face drained of color. "Property ownership records," Sarah's lawyer said evenly, "showing that the home Mr. Wilson claims as his sole asset was purchased through a trust." The judge leaned in. "Whose trust?" he asked. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned slightly. "Mr. Edward Carter," she said, "would you please stand?" The room went still. Edward stood. He didn't look rich. He didn't look powerful. He looked calm. "Yes?" the judge asked. Edward spoke respectfully. "That trust belongs to my daughter." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Daniel's heart pounded. "That's impossible," he muttered. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Carter," he said, "are you stating that the property in question is not Mr. Wilson's?" "Yes, Your Honor," Edward replied. "It was placed in my daughter's name 2 years ago, before the marriage." Daniel shot up from his seat. "That's a lie." The judge's gavel hit the bench. "Sit down, Mr. Wilson." Daniel sat, breathing hard. Mark whispered urgently, "Daniel, why didn't you tell me this?" Daniel didn't answer. Because he hadn't known. Sarah finally looked at Daniel. Just once. And in that look, there was no hatred, only distance. The judge turned back to the documents. "This changes things," he said slowly. Daniel's confidence began to crack, not shattered yet, but cracked. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered. Inside, something far more dangerous was happening. Daniel was realizing the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore, and the man he had dismissed for years was about to step fully into the light. The courtroom no longer felt balanced. Something invisible had shifted, like a chessboard where one player suddenly realized the pieces were never his. Daniel sat frozen, his earlier confidence dissolving into disbelief. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, flipping through papers as if the right document might magically appear and save them. It didn't. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson," he said calmly, You've claimed financial hardship as part of your objection to spousal support. Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, Your Honor. I'm supporting the household alone. My business is under pressure. Sarah's lawyer stood. With respect, she said, that statement is misleading. A new document appeared on the screen. Bank transfers, corporate filings, profit statements. Daniel's eyes widened. These records show that Mr. Wilson transferred significant assets into a private account shortly before asking his wife to leave, the lawyer continued. An account that remained undisclosed. Mark S. Lowly leaned back in his chair. Daniel, he whispered. Tell me this isn't true. Daniel swallowed. It's just savings, he said weakly. The judge looked unimpressed. Savings that exceed 7 figures? He asked. Silence. Then Edward spoke. Your Honor, he said calmly, my daughter never asked for access to those accounts. She trusted him. The word trusted landed heavily in the room. Sarah's hands tightened slightly around her son. The judge looked at her. Mrs. Carter, he asked gently, why didn't you raise these issues earlier? Sarah took a breath. Because I thought marriage meant patience, she said. I thought silence would keep the peace. The courtroom was completely quiet. Even Daniel couldn't look at her now. The judge leaned back, considering. Mr. Wilson, he said, it appears you acted in bad faith. Daniel stood abruptly. This is turning into a witch hunt, he snapped. She married me knowing I was building my career. Now suddenly she's rich. Edward finally turned fully toward Daniel. Suddenly, he repeated quietly. Daniel scoffed. You hid everything. Edward nodded once. Yes, he said. Because we wanted to see who you were without it. That sentence cut deeper than any accusation. The judge raised his hand. Mr. Carter, he said, are you suggesting this wealth was intentionally concealed? Edward met the judge's eyes. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sarah looked shocked, but Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. He deserves to know now, Edward said softly. So does the court. Daniel laughed bitterly. So this was a test. He sneered. You set me up. Edward didn't raise his voice. No, he replied. We gave you freedom. You showed us who you were. Daniel's laughter faded. The judge banged the gavel. Order. He turned to Daniel. This court will not tolerate deception, especially when it endangers a child. Daniel's breath caught. The word child changed everything. A recess was called. In the hallway, Daniel paced like a trapped animal. Reporters whispered. Phones buzzed. Mark pulled him aside. You're in serious trouble, he said bluntly. If this goes the way it's heading, you could lose custody entirely. Daniel rubbed his face. They planned this, he muttered. They humiliated me. Mark shook his head. No, he said. You did. Across the hall, Sarah sat quietly with her parents. She wasn't celebrating. She was exhausted. Margaret touched her arm. You're doing well, she whispered. Sarah shook her head slightly. I never wanted it to be like this. Edward looked at her. Standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel, he said. It makes you honest. Sarah looked down at her sleeping son. I just want him to grow up knowing he's safe, she said. Edward nodded. And he will. When court resumed, Daniel looked smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. The judge addressed the room. Based on the evidence presented today, he said, this court finds reason to question Mr. Wilson's credibility. Daniel closed his eyes. This hearing will continue, the judge added, with full financial disclosure. Mark exhaled sharply. Sarah felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. The truth was finally out. And Daniel, the man who laughed when he believed he had won, was beginning to understand something far worse. This wasn't about losing a divorce. It was about losing control. By the time the court reconvened, Daniel Wilson no longer looked like a man who had won anything. His suit was the same, his posture wasn't. He sat stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the judge, his lawyer, and Sarah, who still hadn't said more than necessary. The power dynamic had shifted so quietly that most people didn't even realize when it happened, but Daniel felt it. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him. Mr. Wilson, he said calmly, this court has reviewed the preliminary disclosures. We will now proceed with full financial examination. Daniel's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we request additional time. Denied, the judge replied immediately. You've had ample opportunity. That single word hit Daniel like a punch. Denied. For years he had been the man who denied others, denied Sarah explanations, denied her respect, denied her security. Now, the word belonged to him. Sarah's legal counsel began methodically. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse emotionally. They simply laid out timelines. 2 years ago, when Sarah and Daniel married, Daniel's company was struggling. What Daniel never disclosed, however, was that the early-stage funding that saved his business didn't come from a bank or a venture firm. It came from a private trust. A trust Sarah never knew she owned. The screen behind the judge lit up with charts, capital injections, shell companies, cross-linked trusts. Daniel's breathing became shallow. Your Honor, Sarah's lawyer said, Mr. Wilson benefited financially from assets indirectly connected to Mrs. Carter's inheritance, without disclosure, consent, or acknowledgement. Daniel stood up abruptly. That's ridiculous, he snapped. I didn't know. The judge's eyes hardened. I find that difficult to believe, he said, especially given the signatures. A document appeared. Daniel's signature. Clear, undeniable. The room went dead silent. Mark leaned toward him, whispering urgently, Daniel, this looks bad. Very bad. Daniel stared at the screen. He remembered signing those papers. He just never read them. Back then, Sarah had trusted him with everything. She believed he would protect her, and he had used that trust like a blank check. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Wilson, he said, did you at any point inform your wife that her assets were being utilized? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Sarah watched him, not with anger, but with something far more devastating. Disappointment. The judge exhaled slowly. This court has seen many divorces, he said. But what concerns me here is not the dissolution of a marriage, it is the pattern of control. Daniel shook his head. She chose to stay quiet, he argued weakly. She never objected. Sarah's lawyer responded calmly. Silence under pressure is not consent. Those words echoed through the courtroom. Then came the moment Daniel had feared without fully understanding why. Edward Carter was called to the stand. He walked forward slowly, deliberately. No rush, no nerves. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. The judge looked at him. Mr. Carter, he said, why was your daughter's inheritance kept private? Edward didn't hesitate. Because I wanted to know who her husband was without it. A murmur ran through the audience. Daniel clenched his fists. You set me up, he muttered. Edward looked directly at him for the first time. No, he said calmly. We gave you an honest life. You turned it into leverage. The judge asked, did you ever intend to intervene in their marriage? Edward shook his head. No. My daughter asked for independence. We respected that. Sarah swallowed hard. Edward continued. But the moment she and her child were put at risk, that independence ended. Daniel laughed bitterly. So now you swoop in as the savior? Edward's voice dropped. No, he said. As a father, that single word carried more authority than anything Daniel had said all day. The judge paused the proceedings. When he returned, his tone had changed, based on what this court has revi. You'd, he said. I am issuing an interim ruling. Daniel felt his heart slam into his ribs. Temporary full custody is granted to Mrs. Carter. Sarah's breath caught. Daniel stood. You can't do this, he said, panic creeping into his voice. That's my son. The judge looked at him steadily. And your actions have demonstrated that you view him as leverage, not responsibility. Daniel turned to Sarah. Say something, he pleaded. You know I didn't mean it like this. Sarah finally stood. Her voice was calm, but firm. I asked you to help me, she said. You told me I was a burden. Daniel's face crumpled. I was stressed, he said. I didn't mean. You meant enough, Sarah replied. Silence fell again, not the silence of weakness. The silence of truth. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Daniel pushed past them, face pale, phone pressed to his ear. This isn't over, he hissed to someone on the line. "I'll fix this." Across the steps, Sarah stood quietly with her parents, holding her child. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't triumphant. She was finally free. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. "The final hearing is next week," he said. "Be ready." Sarah nodded. "I am," she replied. Inside, Daniel's world was collapsing piece by piece. And for the first time, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't a battle he could buy his way out of, because the man he had underestimated, the father he had mocked, hadn't even made his final move yet. The final hearing lasted less than 2 hours, but it ended a life Daniel Wilson would never get back. The courtroom felt different that morning, quieter, heavier, like everyone already knew how this would end, except Daniel himself. He sat alone this time, no confident posture, no smug smile, just a man staring at the floor, replaying every decision that had brought him here. Sarah entered with her parents, her son sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked tired, but calm, not the calm of surrender, the calm of someone who had already survived the worst. The judge took his seat and looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "this court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and disclosures." Daniel swallowed. "This is not a case about money," the judge continued. "It is about responsibility, trust, and the safety of a child." Daniel stood. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "I made mistakes, but I can change. I just need time." The judge studied him for a long moment. "Time," he said slowly, "is exactly what Mrs. Carter gave you. And you used it to strip her of security." Daniel's shoulders sagged. Sarah's lawyer stood and spoke calmly. "My client does not seek revenge. She seeks stability, for her child and herself." The judge nodded. Then came the ruling. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to Mrs. Sarah Carter. Daniel's breath hitched. Mr. Wilson will have supervised visitation, pending completion of counseling and financial compliance. Daniel shook his head, stunned. "And," the judge continued, "due to financial misconduct, undisclosed asset use, and wrongful eviction, this court orders restitution and spousal support." Daniel looked up sharply. "Effective immediately," the judge said, "Mr. Wilson is barred from controlling any assets connected to Mrs. Carter's inheritance." The gavel came down. Just like that, it was over. Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, staring ahead, as if waiting for someone to tell him this was a mistake. Sarah stood quietly. She looked at him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, with acceptance. "I hope you get help," she said softly. "For our son's sake." Daniel tried to speak. No words came out. Edward Carter stepped beside his daughter, steady and silent as ever. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. "Mrs. Carter, is it true your inheritance exceeds $1 billion? How does it feel to win?" Sarah paused. She adjusted her son in her arms. "I didn't win," she said calmly. "I survived." She turned and walked away. Weeks later, Sarah settled into a new home. Not a mansion, not a display of wealth, just a peaceful place filled with light. She donated quietly, invested carefully, lived intentionally. Her son grew strong and happy, never knowing the night his father had forced them into the cold. Daniel, meanwhile, lost more than a case. His reputation, his influence, his control. The man who once bragged about winning the divorce now avoided headlines and mirrors. And the truth? Sarah had been powerful all along. She just never needed to prove it, until the moment she had to protect her child. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's preparation, the end.